While I appreciate Star Wars Bounty Hunter for its narrative that expands the story of Jango Fett, many gameplay elements leave me with a sour taste in my mouth. The game is definitely at its strongest when focusing on the story and narrative. Expanding what we know of the mysterious bounty hunter, the game sets clear motivations for Jango and explains many of the unanswered questions brought up during Attack of the Clones. Jango gets hired by none other than Count Dooku to take out a former Jedi by the name of Komari Vosa, and so begins the hunt for information regarding the location of this former Jedi gone rogue. The gameplay loop, however, is not very interesting. We travel from planet to planet hunting down different targets and bounties, eventually leading us closer towards Vosa. Django is equipped with a scanner which we use to search for people with bounties for their capture or execution. The mechanic feels interesting at first, but as I started the second or third chapter of the game, the usefulness of the scanning mechanic fell apart immediately. It feels like the game is throwing too many enemies at you on the constant. The flow of the gameplay just doesn't mesh well with the slow and calculating way of observing environments as I scan for any bounties. In many ways, the game feels like it tries to be too many things at once. There are platforming sections, heavy emphasis on combat, some sections with stealth, although done in a really half-assed way. And then the entire idea of capturing enemies after identifying them. So in my case, in the later chapters, I honestly just stopped trying to capture any optional bounties at all. It was simply too messy and chaotic for me to stop and actually identify anyone. I felt like there was no there was no pause. There was no way for me to just stop and play like a bounty hunter. I felt like I was just like killing enemies wave after wave. I felt like the pressure was always on me. I couldn't stop and be the bounty hunter the game wanted me to be. There wasn't a time, there wasn't an opportunity. It was always too. There was too much going on at all times, basically. The gunplay is interesting in the sense that there's tons of variety in the equipment you get to use, but mostly you will be whipping out the dual pistols Django is most iconic for. But outside of that, you get a flamethrower, sniper rifle, missiles, poisonous darts, and some other stuff. What makes the gameplay loop feel not too repetitive is the fact that it has platforming sections. Because I gotta say, I really enjoyed these parts. Instead of just moving on the ground, constantly fighting against waves and waves of cronies and space gangsters, I can also take a more vertical approach to my environment due to the jetpack being in use for most of the game. And about the level design, like you really have to be aware of your surroundings and the environment. There's so many areas where you don't necessarily realize to look at the area on a vertical scale, like up and down. But once you do, you see, oh, there's a pathway there. You know, I can fly from balcony to balcony and keep ascending upwards. So there's very interesting areas like that where you don't necessarily see the pathway in front of you, and you kind of have to look at the environment from a new perspective. I found that really interesting, and it made the platform sections quite fun. One more thing I will say in regards to the gunplay though is that the aim lock system is kind of terrible. It's buggy as hell and often causes me more trouble than anything. Eventually I stopped locking into enemies because as long as you're within a short range, Django will aim automatically anyways. That leads me to another point. I encountered quite a few bugs throughout the game, but nothing specifically game breaking. I don't know if this is due to how Aspyr handled the remaster, or if this was always the case back when LucasArts developed the title. Either way, it's worth pointing out that there are bugs that hinder the overall experience a little bit. And oh man, we have to talk about the boss battles. I think there was around 6 in total, and they were insanely easy to beat. I don't know why the boss battles even exist, because it feels like there was no thought or effort put into making them. Either the boss just idly stands still and hits me with one or two predictable attacks, or runs towards me really slowly, enough where I get to evade most attacks and simply blast them with the pistols. There was no sense of danger or unpredictability in these. Absolute letdown. The only time I got my ass kicked during a boss fight was right before the final boss against Montrose. And that happened only because I blew myself up with a missile. With that being said though, Montrose was a really cool character. Going back to the days of the Mandalorian Civil War, he used to fight alongside Django and the other Mandalorians, but the two had become adversaries and Montrose was a much more sinister person compared to Django. I would argue that more than Komari Vosa, who is like the ultimate goal within the game, we are chasing her. But Montrose really, to me, was the primary antagonist. He comes and goes from the beginning of the game to the end and always seems like this looming threat in the background. I just really feel like he is the villain of this game. I'm not gonna go into spoilers, but in many ways, Komari Vosa just she kind of appears at the end of the game and is immediately dealt with. There's no sense of danger. She doesn't feel like a villain in the sense that Montrose does. I almost feel like Komari Vosa is the secondary antagonist in this game. Oh, one thing I have to mention, the flamethrower is absolutely broken. There's very few enemies you can't kill with the slightest touch of your flamethrower. In fact, the final areas felt like such a breeze to go through, because majority of the enemies in the final chapter relied on melee weapons. And before they could even get close enough, they would already be running around in flames. And mind you, this is the final chapter. I felt like it was supposed to be much more difficult, because they do a lot of damage and actually stun you to a point that it's very difficult to get out of it. I feel like it must have been a bit of an oversight of the developers to not realize how overpowered the flamethrower is. As a huge Star Wars fan, there were few references to the movies, such as events or characters, and they were included within the context of the story in this game in such a good way. It was also awesome that when we would travel to different systems, I could feel and see the distinct cultural and environmental differences. Coruscant feels so modern and busy and diverse, while Tatooine felt threatening and in a weird way completely isolated. I want to talk a little bit about the difficulty of this game. It felt weird. Like I told you, the boss fights offer no challenge, but the combat itself is so odd. Every enemy functions the same, more or less, but some just fire at you with insane precision and damage. It's the only difference. There's no tactics, there's no difference in movement, just some guy fires 10 shots at you and misses everyone. Or even when he hits you, it deals very minimal damage. Then the next guy shoots you as I'm flying on the jetpack, and they hit me on the head and take half of my health on one shot. It just feels very cheap, and to add insult to injury, I just felt like the game was superficially increasing the difficulty in such an uninteresting way. It just throws enemies at you wave after wave until you eventually get taken out. And what is this antiquated checkpoint system? You die 5 times and you have to restart the entire chapter? Why? It doesn't feel like there's any reason to put this kind of mechanic in the 21st century. But hey, maybe that's just me. Some of the later chapters just drag on, and it just feels like there's sections of nothing added in between that and the story exposition. And it takes away from the enjoyment of those narrative moments. Honestly, I gotta say, like, I think the second last chapter, which I think is like the chapter 5, I felt exhausted. I felt like I was losing interest because it was just dragging and nothing is happening. However, I felt like the final chapter was appropriate in length. It didn't overstay its welcome at all in the end, and I guess that's really what matters, because I wouldn't want the ending of the game to be where I felt exhausted. So the fact that the last chapter avoided this leaves me, relatively happy. In addition, it was super nice to not only learn more about Jango Fett, but also Zam Wesell, who we briefly saw in the beginning of episode 2, Attack of the Clones, where she tried and failed to assassinate Padme twice. Learning how close the two were in the game makes Jango seem even more cold, as he killed her before she could snitch out on him in the movie, I will say that. But yeah, the two of them just have a really cool dynamic of like this rivalry, but also growing friendship. And to talk about the visuals briefly, game looks great. It's not a remake, but it's a really solid remaster when it comes to the visuals, and the music is done by Jeremy Soule. I was most familiar with his work on the Elder Scrolls franchise, and just as in those games, his music is also very fitting and atmospheric here in Star Wars Bounty Hunter. So, before I close the curtain on this video, I'll answer the most important question. Is this a game worth owning digitally? I'd say for a person who is really into Star Wars or just the character of Jango Fett, it's great, even with its flaws. But for someone not really interested in the Star Wars franchise, I simply cannot recommend it. So that's it for this video. See you in the next one.